So my research is entitled The Representations of India and its Inhabitants in Early Modern English Print Production and Their Reception. It's supervised by docent Veronika Czapska, and it grows out of a broader interest in early modern print culture, public discourse, the ways in which colonial ways of seeing were formed before actual colonial rule itself became fully consolidated. So the main question here stands behind this project, and it's relatively simple, but also quite broad. How did English printed texts and images, visual representations make India intelligible to their readers? More precisely, how did pamphlets, travel accounts, ballads, visual representations, satire explicitly describe India and its inhabitants between the late 16th and late 18th centuries? And how did these descriptions change over time? So the project does not begin with the assumption that colonial ideology appeared suddenly when political domination was already established. Rather, it followed the earlier, slower, more unstable process through which India was repeatedly imagined, it was described, evaluated, exoticized in certain cases, commercialized, and eventually presented as something that should be governed. And in this sense, I'm very interested in pre-colonial period, not only as period before colonial discourse, but as period in which many of its conceptual elements were already being formed. So the talk today will therefore move through the materials diachronically. I will begin with general problem and methodology, of course, but then I will turn to pamphlets, to travel accounts, ballads, and finally, visual representations. So next slide, please. So the starting point of this project is the transformation of India's portrayal in public discourse during the pre-colonial period. So on this slide, I have included two formulations as chronological markers. The first one is the early phrase, very pleasant and rare matters, that was coined by Cesare in 1588. And the second is the much later formulation from Kruse, and I will discuss his writings later in this talk, where Indians are described as natural, unstable, and even ignorant. So between two phrases lies the main problem of my dissertation, and at the end of the 16th century, India still often appears through the language of rarity, of wonder, of certain unusual goods. It was distant, it was very desirable to explore. It was also commercially attractive. And in the later 18th century, material that I have managed to find, however, the emphasis increasingly falls not simply on the richness of the land, but on the supposed deficiencies of the inhabitants, their instability, their ignorance, superstition, cowardice, certain incapacities for long-term judgment, and also, finally, the need for external authority. So this movement is very central for my main argument. So the portrayal of India does not merely become more detailed with the expansion of English knowledge, it also becomes more structured and hierarchical. What began as curiosity about rare matters, as we can see here, and as vocabulary of classification or judgment in religion in relation to British bureaucrats as well, and governance. That's why I tend to understand the transformation of India's image as part of conceptual process of colonialism. And here, colonial expansion depended not only on, people might think, ships, trades, companies, but it also depended on circulation of narratives that made India and its inhabitants appeared governable and knowable. So before India could be treated as an object of political control, it had already been repeatedly turned into an object of comparison, of first of all description, then comparison, and finally public discussion. So in that case, my project asks how this happened through print. It looked at popular print forms that were not confined to learned treatises. So I would be looking at pamphlets, ballads, travel accounts, and satirical prints. So, and what interests me specifically here is the gradual shift from landscape and goods to people and government. Next slide, please. So I will start with methodology, and my corpus. So my corpus consists of four interconnected groups of materials, like I mentioned before: pamphlets, ballads, travel accounts, and visual representations. The period between 1591 and 1790 was selected because it marks the beginning of so-called sustained English interaction with India, and concludes at the moment when British already political and economic dominance became um, very firmly embedded and consolidated through the East India Company. So the largest part of the corpus consists of pamphlets, since pamphlets functioned as one of the central instruments of the early modern English public sphere. The initial pamphlet reservoir consisted of approximately 500 pamphlets identified through early English books online, Igbo TCP, and Harlan Miscellany. Harlan Miscellany itself was very important because it gathered rare pamphlets, tracts connected with political, commercial, imperial questions that were circulating within English public discourse, and I will come to that a bit later. So to identify pamphlets that were concerned specifically with India and its population, I targeted keyword-based selection strategy, and this material that I gathered was filtered through historically relevant terms that included East Indies, East India Company, Mughal Empire, number of various Varnas such as Brahmins, Banyans, trade, foreign policy, so more general ones as well. So I try to follow the initial identification process, and then I downloaded the pamphlets as PDF files and processed through digital tools such as Ancock and Qualcoder. So the final pamphlet corpus consists of 50 pamphlets that were selected diachronically from the larger reservoir that I was talking about. And that selection was intentionally distributed across the entire chronological framework of my dissertation, usually 1 to 2 pamphlets every 4 or 5 years, in order to trace certain gradual narrative transformation rather than isolated examples of that. So my pamphlets were selected according to several criteria, and some of them could be related to direct relation to India, first of all. And then, of course, the density of descriptive material and chronological balance across the period. And I paid particular attention to various recurring representations connected with wealth, luxury, commerce, exoticism, religion, instability, corruption, colonial authority, finally. Then I used such digital tool as Qualcoder for qualitative thematic coding. So each pamphlet was read in full, coded through recurring thematic categories that I have mentioned and various narrative structures. My second group of materials consists of ballads. I will be talking further about them, and mainly they were selected from UCSB English Broadside Ballad Archives, which contain more than 9,900 ballads. And from this larger corpus, approximately 100 ballads connected with India, East Indies were selected, and from these 20 ballads were selected for detailed analysis. The third group of materials consisted of travel accounts. Around 15 major travel accounts connected with India were initially surveyed, and from which 12 so far accounts were selected for close analysis. So I will be talking about each and every account a bit close. Final group of materials consists of visual representations, especially engravings, satirical prints from the second half of the 18th century, and approximately 150 visual materials were initially surveyed through the British Museum collection, the Library of Congress, and related digital collections. And from this huge visual reservoir, 15 visual representations were selected. So the data is cross-referenced with major historical developments, and I'm also following the methodological framework that employs critical discourse analysis following Normer Fairclough's 3-part model of textual description, interpretation, and explanation. So I would be talking about sources. Thank you. So my key sources Like I mentioned, the corpus organized around four source groups: pamphlets, travel accounts, ballads, and visual representations. And my source base reflects this variety. For pamphlets, I use the Holland Miscellany and Early English Books Online. For ballads, I use the UCSB English Broadside Ballad Archive. For travel accounts, Hakluyt Society editions, University of Michigan Library digital collections, the 18th century compilations, such as New General Collection of Voyages and Travels. And for visual materials, I use the Library of Congress, the British Museum Collection, and the National Portrait Gallery. So I will start with pamphlets. The next slide, please. So I begin with pamphlets because they're particularly important for the formation of public discourse. They were forerunners of newspapers. They were very short, argumentative, relatively affordable. They circulated across various social groups. They were often read out loud. This means these ideas contained in them did not only confine to narrow educated circles, but they were much larger. They could travel through households, through some pubs, taverns, marketplaces, and various places of sociability. So in the context of this project, pamphlets are valuable because they show how India entered the public language through repeated, accessible forms. They present India as source of good, as theatre of trade, field of rivalry, later as question of political economy and imperial administration. So my collection is from the library of the Earl of Oxford and Earl Mortimer, and they're collated and edited by Samuel Johnson between 1744 and 1753. So, and it's full, as you can see, subtitle already tells us a great deal about the nature of the collection. So it's a collection of scarce, curious, entertaining pamphlets and tracts. So and perhaps I can show you certain examples when it comes to pamphlets over here. So next slide, please. Here. So the earliest pamphlets examples on this slide are still very strongly connected, as you can see, with the marvel, with commodity. And we shall start with a very, very simple phrase over here, and that dates in 1603. So great store of hens, buffaloes, and bullocks, so many chickens, buffaloes, and cattle. Very simple phrase, yet it shows how India enters the text as space of plentifulness. It emphasizes focus on provisions, on animals, on immediate materials, the richness of its land. So we can also take a look at another early text that is from a continuation of the lamentable and admirable adventures of Don Sebastian, and it refers to many East Indian dishes of sundry colors with other rich things of good esteem. So again, we can see how the East Indies are again associated with visual richness, variety of color, of value, and the representation is sensory over here and also material. But by 1615, the language of trade becomes much clearer. So we can see here the phrase East Indian navigation, which fetches the spices from the wellhead. So it's particularly striking. So coming from the original source, and here India is already imagined as the source, the wellhead from which spices, commodities are drawn. And you can see already commercialized nature of this metaphor, but also almost geographical. India is the origin point of wealth and certain value. At the same time, the same period already contains some unease. So we can see the next line. I found the rest of the benefits alleged by changes, by insultation of pirates, infidelity of servants. And it again shows the commercial benefit that is never presented as pure. It's mixed with lost, it's mixed with piracy, betrayal, and uncertainty. And if we move to the last quarter over here, the 1620s and 1640s, oral language already enters and becomes more visible. And you can see the last line: among the so-called barbarous Indians, some remain strong, healthy, and live nearly 200 years. So it combines, again, some marvel with hierarchy. Here, the emphasis is being placed on longevity. It's extraordinary, right? More than 200 years, but people are already called barbarous. So there is admiration for the exceptional life, but it does not remove the judgment. So it's, again, a very important feature of the early material. India here is not represented negatively. It's rich, it's strange, it's extraordinarily fertile, it's useful, it's marvelous, wonderful, fascinating. Yet the vocabulary of otherness is already presented. And the early pamphlets already showed some sort of layered discourse in which trade, risk, rivalry already began, and even moral judgment, they already began to overlap. Next slide, please. So, and if we move forward, by the middle of the 17th century, India becomes increasingly entangled with English domestic discourse. And we can take a look at the 1642 quotation. So the only question that is asked is what news, not from Aleppo, Constantinople, the Straits or Indies, but from York Island and the Parliament. So, which basically means people ask not about news from foreign places like the Indies, but about political events in England and Ireland. In my opinion, it's a good example. India is already presented as part of the normal circulation of news, but at the same time, the sentence shows that English domestic crisis temporarily displaces foreign affairs and some overseas matters. So we can take a look at another phrase, second 1642 phrase, the great India key to all cabinets. It's also quite metaphorical. India is not here primarily a place, it's a figure of some political intrigue. And which I found quite striking as well is that the Indian population in most pamphlets is almost entirely absent. Especially in early ones, and the word India functions as a very abstract symbol. But we will come to that a bit later. And if we move forward in 1652, the focus returns to trade. You can see here ships coming up the river Thames for London, which laden from the East Indies. And the movement is now from overseas space into London itself. And the East Indies enter the Thames, the city, the economy of the capital. And we can also see some overseas distant commodities that also become quite visible. By the 1670s, India enters fashion, domestic material culture. You can see here the phrase in coaches, a silk suit and an Indian gown. So traveling in coaches while wearing some silk clothing, riding an expensive horse-drawn carriages, sign of wealth, high social status, and Indian clothing. So it would signify that becomes part of the English way of display, of consumption, of perhaps also social distinction. And in 1689, the Indies are connected with private enrichment. So you can see the second last quarter here, he undertook a voyage to Indies, increased his estate so considerably that few men in those parts lived in greater splendor. It's again, India is a road to fortune, to status, to splendor, and we can also see it over here. And finally, by the late 18th century, the vocabulary changes again, and it's a very famous William Gordon's pamphlet that refers to many individuals of different nations whose whole property is vested in the funds of the East India Company. So what we can see here is that at this point, late 18th century, India is not only a place of goods, of voyages, but it's so-called financial structure. And the name of India is getting embedded into funds, into investments. So across the pamphlets, the movement is gradual, but I argue that it's quite visible. India as some sort of marvel, abundance, India as trade, India as news, India as metaphor, as luxury, as a way of getting rich and full of fortune, and finally, India as finance and governance. And this is one of, again, main diachronic patterns over here. Next slide, please. I now move to travel accounts, which also occupy one of the most central places in my project. They're very important, in my opinion, as they combine historical and ethnographic writing with commercial, with diplomatic, and also personal observation, and they appear in various forms. So you can see letters, journals, diaries, particular logbooks, embassy reports, narratives, that were intended for publications. They were also read by white audience, humanists, clergy, aristocrats, merchants, shopkeepers, and rich and literate peasants. So again, I argue that travel writing helped to shape not only learned knowledge, but also broader perception of non-Europeans. And the authority of travel accounts came from the claim that the traveler had seen the place directly, and this claim of observation made this genre especially powerful. A traveler could write about government, about religion, about various types of clothing, food, labor. At the same time, this genre is never neutral. Travel accounts do not simply reproduce what was seen. They select, they compare, they judge, in particular examples, they also try to translate some unfamiliar practices into categories that English readers could recognize, such as civility, barbarism, tyranny, superstition, courage versus cowardice, good government, bad government, labor, profit. And the travel accounts used here come from Hakluyt Society editions, the University of Michigan Library digital collections, and the New General Collection of Voyages and Travels that was printed in 1745. And the Hakluyt Society is very important here because it was founded in 1846, but it published scholarly editions of primary records of voyages and travels. The society was named after Richard Hakluyt, the collector and editor of narratives of voyages and travels, and also other documents that were related to English interest overseas. So for today's talk, I focus especially on Sir Thomas Roe, Edward Terry, John Fryer, Alexander Hamilton, and John Henry Grocer. And I try to place them in sequence and in order to show how travel writings moves from diplomatic, courtly observations to something much stronger in commercial, in racialized sense, and also some sort of judgment that is connected to administrative purposes. Next slide, please. So the first travel account I discuss is Sir Thomas Roe's embassy to the court of Tehrangar between 1615 and 1618. So Sir Thomas Roe was the English ambassador who was sent to the Mughal court during the reign of James I. His mission was significant for the early history of English relations with India because it was connected with the attempt to secure firmer commercial positions for the English traders at the Mughal court. The edition I use here is Sir Thomas Roe to the Court of Great Mughal that was printed for the Hakluyt Society in London in 1899. And you can see here Forster's introduction, which is already quite interesting because it reads Roe's mission retrospectively through the later history of British India after 200 years. So he writes that the mission was not only a remarkable episode of the life of a remarkable man, but an event of high importance in the history both of England and India. And then he describes the footing obtained by the despised traders from the West and the first step in a march of conquest. So this editorial framing matters because it turns Roe's embassy into the beginning of a longer imperial story. That's why I'm starting with him. And I argue it's not merely a diplomatic record, but increasingly popular document and with huge significance that is retrospectively tied to British imperial expansion. And Raw's own account gives a very rich picture of the Mughal court. And you can see here the first quotation on the slide that states the people are very subtle, cunning and bargaining, and constant in all their words. So here you can see commercial difficulty that becomes moral character. At the same time, Rose is fascinated by wealth, by courtly splendor. He writes about the king and about his beloved wife, who has lots of power. And then he describes a present of 36 elephants, 50 horses richly furnished, 10 lakhs of rupees in jewels. So it's basically the language of courtly excess, elephants, horses, gifts, female political influence as well. There is one more phrase: they keep their horses most delicately fed with butter and sugar. And again, it adds another layer to this image. So he was talking about luxury, but it's not only confined to people or jewels. It extends even to animals. India is a world of extreme wealth, care, and huge refinement. What is also striking here is the coexistence of certain sort of admiration and irritation. So the court is splendid, it's wealthy, it's politically impressive, yet the people encountered in negotiations are described as cunning, as unreliable. So I would argue that this combination becomes very important for later materials. India is admired for its wealth, for its splendor, but this admiration does not prevent the development of moral and cultural hierarchy. Next slide, please. Another traveler is Edward Terry, who arrived in India when Sir Thomas Raw asked him to become the new chaplain for the English embassy. So Terry then spent around 2.5 years with Raw as they followed the Mughal court of Jaipur through what is today states of Gujarat and Bihar. His account is extraordinarily interesting as well. It contains some of the strongest positive descriptions of India in the travel materials. He calls India the most spacious, fertile monarchy, called by the inhabitants Hindustans, and writes that it so much abounds in all necessaries for the use service of man to feed, to clothe, and enrich him. And it can flourish of itself, which is very important, without the least help from any neighbor, prince, or nation. Very powerful statement, in my opinion, that shows India's self-sufficiency. It's not lacking anything, according to Terry. It's spacious, it's fertile, it's absolutely capable of its own flourishing without any so-called external assistance. Terry, as you can see here, also acknowledges skill and manufacture. He writes that the natives, they show very much ingenuity in their curious manufactures, especially in silk stuffs, carpets, cabinets, boxes, trunks, and very refined Indian production here. Yet, as so often in the corpus that I managed to gather, admiration is immediately limited by judgment. Terry continues with the claim that the people here in general are cowardly. He then describes their appearance: long moustaches, bad chins, comparison to the pictures of our old Britons, as I would presume in early modern English imaginations, ancient Britons were often imagined as rough, as wild-looking, semi-barbarous figures. He also speak about non-worthies, very famous heroic figures from medieval and early modern culture, included King Arthur, Charlemagne, Godfrey of Bouillon. But he also adds that it's basically not a compliment. He does not refer them as some like connecting Indians to this figures as not elegant heroic images, but more like the way root painters painted them. So root painters, unskilled crude painters. So basically Indian men look like extraordinarily badly painted, exaggerated, old-fashioned heroic figures. And finally, he, as being a chaplain, invokes the biblical examples from Ephraim's Psalm 78, who, being armed, carrying bows, turned their backs in the day of battle. So he uses this biblical reference to support his accusation of Indians as being cowards. So basically, he's saying that Indian men look frightening, armed, masculine, but in reality, they're cowardly. And the movement in this text is, in my opinion, very revealing. India is fertile, it's abundant, it's marvelous. Indian artists are skillful, but needless to say that the population is still subjected to moral classification and courage, such features as masculinity, their physical appearance, their bodily representation become some sort of a site of judgment. Next slide, please. I would also like to highlight the account made by John Fry. He was an English medical doctor, fellow of the Royal Society, and now he is best remembered for his descriptions of travel in India. His account is very useful for my project, and it shows a very explicit movement towards the language of control. So the central passage here is referring to the tyrannical government in India as a necessity to keep them under, as abstaining from flesh and washing their bodies to keep them in health. So very clear example in the corpus where already domination is being represented as some sort of necessity. And Fry continues by saying that this is the reason they value the English, who are content with bombing. So he describes Indian society as well in relation to trade. And he is talking about Banyans and Brahmins. Banyans here refer to Indian merchant communities, especially Hindu commercial groups, but they do not command the awe by which these people are best taught to understand themselves. A very, in my opinion, remarkable passage. They are fine with peaceful trade. It's presented almost yet as insufficient. So the English men are being praised by local population, but they do not command awe. So the implication is that Indian people understand themselves best through some power, fear, or high authority. And you can already see that the language moves beyond observation to already some sort of political theory of domination. And we have the shorter quotation finally. The washers are the craftsmen, work well for little money. It adds some sort of economic dimension over here. Indian labor is skilled and cheap. Next slide, please. I would like also to mention Alexander Hamilton and his new account of the East Indies. He was an East India Company officer, privateer and merchant. He arrived in Bombay in 1688, and he was briefly pressed into the company's service in local war. Then he established himself as a private country trader who operated from Surat. And his account is very remarkable, yet rather innocent, because it shows and presents India through the language of agricultural abundance and various valuable natural sources. So you can see over here that the country abounds richly in wheat, rice. So the land is extraordinarily fertile. It's almost protected from scarcity. Yeah, so the misery of famine. The absence of famine is also very amazing part of the image of natural plenty of the country. The second quotation again explains fertility through the Indus. The third quotation lists production, as you can see here. The list reads almost like commercial inventory, and it's a storehouse of useful, rare, valuable materials. And so Hamilton's account belongs to, again, this discourse of abundance of India's a marvel flourishing country. But again, he does not mention the population. And I would suggest that here the land is valuable because it produces. It can be known for crops, animals, various rare substances, silk. So he does not primarily moralize the population in the quotations that I use here, but he makes India economically legible. Next slide, please. And the last travel account is extraordinarily rich. That is dedicated to John Henry Grocer, a British traveler, writer who was affiliated with the British East India Company again. And his voyage to the East Indies marks a very noticeable harsher movement in the travel account material. And I started with him as well. So the first quotation, again, describes India as, again, natural, unliable, ignorant of their own interests. This is, in my opinion, is very important. It naturalizes their economic, cultural incapacity. People are presented as naturally incapable of understanding their own long-term interests. Their language is very close to colonial justification because it implies that economic, political management from outside may be necessary. The second quotation concerns sati ritual. And you might take a look over here that the word barbarous, again, does a great deal of work. The barbarous custom still continues of women burning, being buried with their husbands. And again, specific religious social practices made into evidence. And the third quotation states it's also observed that Brahmins, Banyans, do not want for the twice of coverts, very dense, in my opinion, moral judgment. So it's called the vice of coverts, and it's attributed precisely to such varnas as Brahmins and Banyans, social groups that connected with learning, with religion, with commerce. So even the best so-called socially important Indians are already presented as having some moral flaws. And we can also see the visual on this slide. The west side of Bombay Green was drawn by the author, the Grocer, and I would say that it should be read together with this language. The image depicts a place, and it also organizes the way of seeing. There are large buildings that dominate the center of this image, and maybe it's not quite visible, but there are some Indian figures that are small, that are scattered, and that are engaged in some labor movement. And you can see that people here are not individualized entirely. Next slide, please. And my next slide continues with grocers, and it focuses on religious differences. And you can see the quotation that refers to ancient customary practices. And then it describes people as having not a legitimate religion, but as the follies of divination, conjuring the sick and the like. And this phrase, again, in my opinion, places Indian practices within the language more not religious practices, but more superstition. So they're not treated as some systems in that period of knowledge, and they're solely reduced as something that is foolish. And we can also see the visual over here. The past is repository for the dead, and it again deepens this effect. It's taken again from this travel account, and it's the Zoroastrian community in India that is especially associated with Western India and Bombay. Repository for the dead, it means a place where dead bodies are being placed, and it's related to funerary structure commonly known as Tower of Silence. And in Zoroastrian practice, the dead body should not be buried, should not be burned as well, because of earth and fire that should be always considered as so-called pure elements that should not be polluted by death. And instead, bodies were exposed in a raised circular structure where birds consumed the body. So it's again quite a lively example of it. And next slide, please. I may now turn to ballads, very short narratives in verse, printed on single sheets, intended for oral performance. They were often attached to walls, they were sung, they were repeated, they were circulated in ways that could reach various types of audiences far beyond the readers of long prose accounts. Their source has been here very rich UC as B English broadside ballad archives, and we can trace some differences over here as well. So in the early 17th century, India appears as well. So it's a place of temptation as well. And you can see here the very first line, you promised you would never leave me, not even for a huge amount of Indian gold. So again, Indian gold, the measure of extreme value, of richness. India itself is not described. It's a very metaphorical name for some extraordinary, some fabulous wealth. And similarly, the same one, but for all that Indian wealth, none shall have him but myself. So you promised, I would suggest the lover would be saying that you would never leave me, not even for a huge amount of Indian gold. And again, India is very symbolical over here. And it's not even a geographical place, in my opinion. It's some shorthand for some immense wealth and riches. But by the mid 17th century, the imagery becomes more ambivalent. You might take a look at the next example that I managed to put here, and we shall take a look at the words such as Indian ore. That might probably mean some wealth, some resources, and again, it continues the language of wealth, but it brings an idea of danger, something that is lost, those shall not fail unto the Indian coast, for in such dangers my love might be lost. So I would presume someone feels a loved one traveling to India because the voyage is dangerous. Again, it introduces another narrative such as distance, such as danger. So it's not only reach, but it's rather far away and it's quite dangerous to reach it. We can take a look at some more examples. More than his Indian pearl or his gold lace. So someone, I guess, is adorned more beautifully than Indian pearls or gold lace. And another quite an interesting example. By the late 17th century, India is connected with luxury, with exotic sensations again. So Indian pearl, gold lace, Indian odor. So someone's words are sweeter than Indian fragrance. And these quotes would suggest some imported pleasure, but the 1682 line, not Indians' wealth can England's peace betray, introduces another quite an interesting theme, such as political anxiety. So England's peace can be destroyed by Indian wealth. And by 18th century, the shift has shifted further. And we can take a look at the very last quotation over here that places East India traders outside national gratitude. So all except gaolers or East Indian traders. So gaolers would mean jailers. And basically people who run prisons, probably because some event has reduced their profit, power, some usefulness. But why East India traders? Because I would presume they're being grouped with morally suspicious figures, and it can be again associated with such themes as greed, as speculation, as corruption, as some sort of harm to nature. And finally, over here, the later reference adds another dimension as India's place of exile, as escape and reinvention, and some disreputable people might live for Indians. And next slide, please. Yeah, I would now move to the final part of my presentation, the visual materials, very shortly, and particularly satirical prints from the end of 18th century, 1770s and 1780s. These images are especially important, in my opinion, because they, by later 18th century, India had become deeply integrated into British political discourse itself. It was no longer a distant territory of spicy, but it became uh, um, embedded into corruption, imperial expansion, finance. And we can take a look at the first very influential picture, visual representation that shows Charles James Fox, who was one of the most important Whig politicians of that period, and Edmund Burke, who strongly supported parliamentary reform of the East India Company after years of scandals, of accusations of corruption. And in this print, on the left, Fox is shown dressed as an Oriental ruler. He's sitting on an elephant, moving towards the East India House in Leadenhall Street, the headquarters at that time of the company itself. It was painted by James Sayers, and it's held in British Museum. His works are held in British Museum and National Portrait Gallery. So again, it's related to Charles James Fox India Bill of 1783, and that bill proposed to transfer control of British India to commissioners, but it was defeated in the House of Lords because of the influence of King George III. And if we take a look at the elephant, it's not simply symbolizing India. More precisely, it's an elephant with the face of Lord North. And at that period of time, Charles Fox and Lord North were political allies. Fox is sitting on the elephant. He is dressed as Oriental Prince, which turns him into Carlo Khan, a very satirical version of Charles Fox. As an Eastern despot, he called himself, Charles Fox, the man of the people, but as we can see here, it's replaced with, my Greek is terrible, but I think it King of Kings, Vasilevs Vasilion. That suggests that Fox's supposed popular politics have been transformed into some tyrannical imperial ambition. And Burke leads the elephant and blows the trumpet with a banner. It's not quite visible over here, but it shows a map of India. And again, it's also quite important. Burke was one of the major supporters of reforming East India Company. The next one is also by James Sayers, and the print again attacks Fox India Bill. He's carrying over here the East India House, meaning the headquarters of the East Indian Company, toward a gateway that really resembles St. James Palace. The word stock is very important here. It refers to India Company stock, meaning shares in his company. So the company was not only a trading body, but it was also financial. It was a political structure, and people invested in it, and it held its stock. The paper falling from the East India House, also quite remarkable. They mention East India stock, India bonds, directors, governors, and they show India being converted into some bureaucratic nature and offices, revenue collection, stuff like that. And it's not quite visible, but the paper in Fox's pocket is dedicated to new arrangement, 7 emperors, 8 governors, 8,000 deputies. So the author is trying to mock the huge administrative system that the bill was imagined to create, but it never worked. And the next slide, please. And finally, I would like to show 2 more pictures over here. So the Nabob Rumbled, or Lord Advocate's Amusement. It comes from the British Museum collection. It belongs to the late 18th century wave of political satire surrounding, again, the East India Company. And again, the term Nabob, that originally derived from the Mughal title Nawab. In the 18th century Britain, quite a very different meaning. It referred to East India Company officials who returned from India with the enormous fortunes that accumulated through company service. And these people often purchased estates, they entered parliament, and they wanted really to integrate themselves into British elites. So they became very controversial figures in public discourse. So the central figure here is Sir Thomas Rumbold. He had served as governor of Madras for 2 years, end of 18th century, and he was deeply criticized for corruption and misconduct. He was even under parliamentary investigation at the end, and that's why widely attacked in public and political discourse. So he's presented here as extremely grotesque in a very humiliating way. He's stands vomiting money, guineas, into chamber pot. That is held by Henry Dundas, the Lord of Scotland and one of the most influential political figures connected with imperial administration. And later he became central to British imperial governance and East India policy. Also quite interesting is the elephant in the background. And elephants had already become standard visual shorthands for India within British satirical art. Here, however, as we can see, the elephant carries some bags labeled rupees, and that again turns India directly into some transportable wealth. And at the same time, we can see an Indian servant that holds an umbrella over the rider. It reproduces the imagery of certain hierarchy and also some theme of Oriental wealth and luxury. And finally, a sale of English beauties in the East Indies. It was done by James Gilray, again, 18th century. And in my opinion, it reflects particular anxieties, not only about money, but also about morality, as well as the first picture about morality, about social order. It exaggeratedly imagines India as a place where English women are effectively so-called sold within colonial marriage markets. And again, it shows some broad 18th century phenomenon in which British women traveled to India hoping to manage to secure wealthy husbands among company officials and some colonial elites. However, Gilray transforms this social rarity into satire. It's deeply exaggerated. The language of sale is very crucial here. Women become commodities in a certain way, and they're almost interchangeable with goods or luxuries. So, and again, marriage itself here is represented through some vocabulary of commerce, of exchange. And in my opinion, it's again a larger fear that was presented at that time in the 18th century Britain, that imperial wealth was trying to erode traditional norms, social, moral values of the country. And India was, in a certain way, morally destabilizing. And so to conclude, I would like to return to the main movement of my doctoral project. So across pamphlets, across travel accounts, ballads, visual satire, India is never represented in only one way. The discourse is layered. Sometimes it's even contradictory. India, from fertile, can become barbarous, can be wealthy and dangerous, can be skillful but full of cowards, can be very commercially desirable, but again, morally corrupting, can be distant and deeply presented in English discourse. So within the co-section, my wider dissertation will also move beyond England and ask how this representation circulated in Central Europe, especially in the Habsburg Czech lands. And in my opinion, it's crucial because Europe was not homogeneous. English colonial ideas did not travel into a very empty European space. They were mediated through German translations, libraries, scholarly networks, pirate printing projects. So in this way, I hope my project will also seek to somehow contribute to a more differentiated understanding of Europe's India. So with that being said, thank you very much for your attention.